I want to take this opportunity to welcome everyone who's here today to New York Peace Institute's first virtual event as part of our 2020 PeaceRaiser. My name is Jennifer Megita, and I'm the CEO of Peace Institute, and I'm thrilled to welcome you all to our discussion today, Conflict, Caring, and COVID, Views from Around the World. Before we start, I wanted to take a brief minute to let you know who we are and what we do, especially for those of you who don't know about the New York Peace Institute. I also want to share with you how the New York Peace Institute has stepped up to work remotely and serve New York City communities during the current health crisis. New York Peace Institute is a nonprofit organization dedicated to navigating and helping people emerge from conflict and incidents of harm. Conflict impacts each and every one of us on a daily basis, yet living with conflict can have adverse consequences personally, professionally, and for society in a broader sense. We help thousands of people per year through our wide range of mediation programs, restorative justice offerings, and through our training programs through which we train and certify mediators. All of New York Peace Institute services are offered free of charge with the exception of a few training programs, and we serve anyone and everyone. New York Peace Institute helps individuals address and work through conflicts in a variety of ways. For example, we mediate disputes in family court, housing court, and civil court. We provide mediation and conflict coaching to individuals in the criminal justice system. And we mediate disputes between parents of children with special needs and the Department of Education about IEPs. We also provide restorative justice services and help groups heal from incidents of harm. We work in the school system. We work in tandem with the Department of Probation. We teach conflict resolution skills so people can better manage conflicts on their own. For example, we train 300 to 350 New York police officers every year to use mediation skills as they de-escalate conflict in their own communities. So we do a lot. And as you all know, we live in a time of great conflict, comes in many forms, and the current health pandemic has given rise to increased conflict, stress, and tension, all of which we as an organization are working to address. Since this pandemic hit the United States, our staff, our mediators, and our community have stepped up and said, what can we do? What we're finding is that the scarier life seems, the longer people are in quarantine, the more people are needing our services. This is our new reality and might be for some time. And like everyone around the world, including all of our panelists here today, we are navigating some uncharted waters. But we are here, we're ready to help, and we're responding to COVID-19 to support our communities. We're finding that families are dealing with new living and working situations, and the Peace Institute is helping them to mediate disagreements, especially those with co-parenting situations and other stressful circumstances. New Yorkers can't pay their rent right now, and unemployment is an all-time high. So we're working with the City of New York to implement a new program to mediate amended lease agreements and enable people to stay in their homes. Communities are struggling with no outlet or place to address their concerns, and social interaction is all but eliminated from our lives. So we're providing virtual talking circles to allow people the opportunity to vent, reflect, and be part of a community. And organizations are figuring out how to realign their work and their organizational structures, and we're supporting organizations needing to adapt. We're facilitating difficult conversations and supporting employees as they strive to get their work done in new and unfamiliar ways. Our annual PeaceRaiser, a fun cocktail party and our biggest fundraising event, was scheduled to take place on April 30th. In light of COVID-19, we had to cancel the party. We were disappointed at the missed opportunity to celebrate the work of our staff, our tremendous volunteer mediators, and all of our partners. So we modified the plan, and here we are today. We decided to launch an online fundraiser, and we're hosting a series of virtual events to highlight the amazing work, not just of New York Peace Institute, but of all the nonprofits around the world who are doing important peacekeeping work. We are excited to share this conversation with peacekeepers from around the world today. And so we welcome you. We thank all of our panelists for being here. You'll have the opportunity to meet in a couple minutes. And I am excited to share with you this wonderful and engaging experience. And I hope you'll take the opportunity now and after to learn more about the Peace Institute, all of our services. And I also hope you'll consider supporting our work and all the work of nonprofits throughout the world who are fighting so hard for people everywhere. So without further ado, I'm very excited to turn this over to our fabulous board member, Gay Rosenblum Kumar, who's been working as a peacekeeper in the international arena for years and has been working with New York Peace Institute for many, many years as well. So thank you so much, Gay. Thank you all the panelists for being here.
Thanks, Jen. I'm honored to be a board member of New York Peace Institute and glad that I could do this and pull together such a prestigious panel. The reason why I wanted to organize this session is to give insight into the challenges the pandemic is putting on peacebuilders around the world. You articulated well the ones in New York City, and I hope now we'll hear more about the challenges in the global south and conflict-affected areas. And I also think it will help us comprehend the magnitude of the issues we're facing, perhaps by looking outside our own setting to learn from other environments, and then look back on our own situation to know it better. First, I want to say, in conflict-affected parts of the world, this is an emergency on top of an emergency. Do most people know that even before this pandemic, the world had its largest number of refugees and displaced persons ever recorded, more than in the world wars? Over 70 million people displaced. That means that this population of refugees and internally displaced people could be the 20th largest country in the world today, larger than the population of England or France. So already the world was at catastrophic degrees of being able to take care of people in need. Now, many of you have heard, I hope, that UN Secretary General Guterres put out a call for a global ceasefire in March in light of the pandemic. But have you also seen the disappointing news that the UN Security Council has yet to pass a resolution because the US continues to block a mention of the World Health Organization or wants to call this the Chinese virus? So the Security Council has been rendered basically irrelevant by the major power of the world. But despite this paralysis, I'm happy to say that 16 conflict parties at last count in Latin America, Africa, the Middle East, and East Asia have declared unilateral ceasefires, or at least pauses since the appeal. But other parties, as you'll hear, are taking advantage and stepping up attacks and increasing divisions. But I'll stop. I just wanted to set the global stage, and I want to hand over to our panelists, who are, I'm incredibly honored that they agreed to be here. They are each in their way respected members and founders of peacebuilding. And in the first round, I'm going to ask them to share briefly about the work of their organizations in general before the pandemic, so you can get a sense of what kind and how much work was already being done by them individually and through organizations and other civil society groups doing peace building and conflict resolution, similar to what the New York Peace Institute does in New York. After that, we'll go back to each panelist and ask them to share how their work has changed, the new problems they're facing, how the virus pandemic has exacerbated the work, and then we'll go from there and open up. Now, I'm going to be a pretty strict timekeeper, I hope. 3 minutes each for this first part, and I'd like to start with Mavic Cabrera, founder and director of Global Network of Women Peacebuilders. Thanks, and over to you, Mavic.
Thank you, Gay, and thanks to the New York Peace Institute for organizing this very important conversation. And I cannot agree more with you when you emphasize that we need to look outside of our own environment. And I cannot think of any other situation where that is stressed all the more, that what's happening here in New York is very much related to what's happening in the Philippines, my home country, in Afghanistan, in Colombia, and South Sudan, and so on and so forth. The crisis has put on the spotlight the fragility of national governments, the fragility of health institutions. So the response to COVID is just as strong as the weakest national health care system. So very quickly, the Global Network of Women Peacebuilders, which I represent, is a coalition of women's rights organizations and civil society groups from around the world. We're now over 120 organizations from more than 40 countries. And the range of work of the network vary broadly, anywhere from maintenance of shelters for survivors of rape and other forms of sexual violence to providing medical and psychosocial counseling, providing legal assistance to the survivors, to initiating livelihood projects in conflict-affected communities, to engaging negotiating parties to ensure that women and youth peace builders are up front and center in all of those processes, not only during the peace negotiations, but after, particularly in the implementation of peace agreement. And we're also very much involved in developing national action plans, which are the instruments that government use to respond to their obligations under United Nations Security Council Resolution 1325 on women, peace, and security, and the 9 supporting resolutions. And we emphasize that the national action plans cannot be developed without participation, strong participation of civil society, especially women and youth peace builders, and that national action plans should not just be documents gathering dust on the shelves of bureaucracy, but are actually implemented to guarantee women's participation, women's leadership, protection from sexual and gender-based violence, protection of women and girls' rights, but also prevention of conflict itself. I can talk for hours about the amazing work of the local women peace builders that we do, but I'll stop here, and I look forward to hearing the wonderful work that my the organizations represented by my fellow panelists are doing.
Thank you, Mavic. That was amazingly just 3 minutes, perfect. Now I'll hand over to Provo Shankara Narayan, the President and Director of Mediators Beyond Borders. Thanks, Provo.
Thank you. Thank you, Jennifer and Gay, for the opportunity to talk and be in conversation with old friends and colleagues. Mediators Beyond Borders International started with the idea of the world being a better place if there were peace builders instead of bombs in war zones around the world. Out of that rather idealistic notion grew the organization of volunteers. It's largely a volunteer organization with a very small group of staff. And our focus has been on simply building a peace-able world. And that we do through advocating for conflict resolution and transformation processes in all kinds of arenas. We support capacity building efforts around the world, and we go where we are invited. And we also provide direct facilitation services when it's appropriate. But our basic belief that people at the heart of the conflict need to be a part of the solution really leads us to supportive roles in many instances. So in terms of our advocacy, we've been a part of the Climate Change Conference of the Parties for the last 10 years. And we'll say that we managed to get facilitation into the Paris Agreement and played a small role in that. And then in terms of capacity building, we go to different countries where we're invited. And it takes a whole range of activities in which we are engaged. And our consultation services are when nonprofits, corporations, communities, and governments intersect, we design and facilitate processes. And so it's been an incredible experience to hear the voices of our partners, which I will talk about more. And you can all read about us online. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Prabha. Next, I'll turn to my good friend, Alma Abdulhadi Jadala, who is an adjunct professor in the School of Conflict Analysis and Resolution, now the Carter School at George Mason, and the director and founder of Common Denominator. Thanks, Alma.
Thank you, Gay. I reciprocate the sentiment, and as they say, hats off for everybody who spoke ahead of me for their efforts. It's very, it touches you in the heart when you hear how many people are committed to this kind of work. Common Denominator was established in 2005 by 3 of us, social scientists, the graduate of the then Institute for Conflict Analysis and Resolution, then school, and now the Carter and Roslin School for Peace Building and Resolution. And our ideas were quite simple. We wanted to share the science that we learned and share it with the rest of the world. and truly for the peaceful resolution of conflict on all levels, communal, organizational, national, and international. Currently, we have evolved quite a bit into a network of conflict resolution practitioners. We like to say dedicated to the well-being of everybody. And similar to other colleagues, we design processes, we advise governments, we work with communities, we work with organizations, but around three main ideas: prevention, intervention, and post-intervention, and all dedicated with the highest ethical standards of do no harm. And I'll stop there, but one recent example that I think we should be all proud of and thinking of in light of COVID-19 is some work we're doing recently in Iraq around developing the framework for security and development. And I can speak later more about that, so thank you.
Thank you, Alma. Last but not least, I'll turn to my dear friend Mel Duncan, founder and director of advocacy of Nonviolent Peaceforce, which I also work for as their UN representative. Over to you, Mel.
Well, thank you, Gay, and thank you everyone, including the New York Peace Institute, for bringing us together. It's in a time like this, it's just nice to be with you. So thank you. Nonviolent Peaceforce provides direct protection to civilians who are under threat of war and physical violence. As Gay mentioned in her introduction, over 70 million of us have to flee our homes because of violent conflict, and that number is growing every day. And it is even growing faster now with the pandemic. So we have teams of well-trained, unarmed civilian peacekeepers who are invited to areas of violent conflict where we live and work with local communities on protection of civilians and prevention of further violence. So for example, in South Sudan, where we still have our people on location in 16 areas around the country, one of the things that we do is to provide accompaniment to women who are under threat when they go for essentials like firewood. Routinely, women are raped when they are doing those tasks by both government soldiers as well as the rebels. We find that if we send 3 to 5 of our peacekeepers with 20 to 30 women, the women are not attacked. That has been 100% successful over 4 years. In Iraq, we have teams that are living now in the camps where internally displaced people are being held and who are especially vulnerable at night to violence and to especially gender-based violence. And again, if we have our teams simply visible and walking the lanes inside of the camps, people are safer. We have teams in other places in Myanmar, in the Philippines, where we've been a part of a ceasefire agreement that was signed in 2009, working on the civilian protection element of that. Half of our teams come from 45 different countries, and the other half come from the host country. And unlike armed peacekeeping, over half of our peacekeepers in the field are women, and they play incredibly important roles. So now as we enter a time where we're going to be stretched for funds and where there will be more conflict, or at least the potential for that, we have to find effective and affordable ways where first people can protect themselves, and if the violence is too acute, where they can be protected without the imposition of weapons and other guns and other weapons.
Thank you, Mel. Thanks, everyone. Now, I think you've all just heard just the surface about all the positive work that's going on in the face of some of these complex situations. And the COVID-19 pandemic has magnified these problems in so many ways. It's increased the conflict stressors in communities, it's exacerbated existing inequalities, magnified mistrust and discrimination, been used by bad actors to cast blame on a minority or a religion or immigrants. It's created more misinformation, and unfortunately some governments have also exploited it to take more control or silence opposition or stop free speech. So it's clear that the coronavirus has had a profound impact on peace-building work, and also shifting people from struggling already with their conflicts to shifting to other needs, but without solving the underlying root causes. And there's a high degree of uncertainty among peace builders on how to sustain their work. Just like the New York Peace Institute, many are facing financial cutbacks. Many shifts to humanitarian work make people think, oh, maybe peace building can wait. But while there's an obvious need for medical and humanitarian help, cutting back peace building at a time when this is actually integral to protecting communities, we all think is the wrong move. So we're all struggling to maintain our work. A Peace Direct, another peace building organization, recent report says that social distancing is very hard now. Obviously, people cannot go out, and we have to find new ways. And I think you'll hear about some of those new ways, from youth in Ghana going around with cars and megaphones trying to share information about how to protect people from the virus. This is also affecting mental health in unforeseen ways, in our own culture as well as in others. But in conflict countries affected, it's resurrecting old trauma. And we have to deal with that and also look at how to be creative and use all the resources in a society like youth and women. And you'll hear more. As I turn back to the panelists, I just want to underline that peace building groups who work at the grassroots level become part of the community. They are trusted and respected. They can galvanize civil society to organize in really appropriate local ways. And even the internationals and government efforts will not be effective without them. So these groups that you will now hear from are key to ensuring that peace building continues to mitigate conflict as the virus heightens tensions and divides people. So with that, I would like to go back to the panelists and ask them now to talk about what they have seen or heard about how COVID-19 is affecting various communities, and if they can, what they're doing. And for simplicity's sake, why don't we just keep the same order? I'll start with Mavic, please.
Yeah, thank you, Gay. I'll start with the challenges that women and youth peace builders are confronting because of the COVID-19 crisis. And some of it you've already pointed out. The COVID-19 pandemic has caused major disruption to our work, the work of local women and youth peace builders. For example, in South Sudan, just before the major outbreak of the pandemic, the government and opposition have finally established the Transitional National Government of Unity, which is one of the key points in the revitalized peace agreement in South Sudan. And an important component of this is the 35% quota for women's participation. It would have been a critical moment to push for the realization of the quota, to translate the words of the peace agreement into reality until COVID-19 crisis. And another example in the Philippines, the peace agreement between the government and the Moro Islamic Liberation Front was signed a few years ago. And the process is accurately described as transition from rebellion to governance, because the peace agreement, the center piece of it is the establishment of an autonomous government in Muslim Mindanao region. And it was already well on its way, establishing the administrative code, establishing the executive arm, including the Women's Commission, the Bangsamoro Women's Commission. But all of that was put into an abrupt stop because of the crisis. Another key challenge is the increased security risk. Unfortunately, a number of governments are taking advantage of the crisis situation to claim more powers than they already have. And the response to the health crisis is a very militarized or securitized response. As you know, people are demanding tests, for example, but the government response is arrest. So arrest instead of mass tests for COVID-19. And there's also increase in surveillance in many countries. The excuse is that this is part of, contact tracing, this is part of monitoring the scope of the pandemic, but we're also seeing increased harassment of peace activists, of human rights defenders. And here, Colombia is a good example. One of the responses of the government to the crisis is to lessen or reduce the protection measures that are provided to human rights defenders that are at risk. So they are exposed to even greater danger. And in what is also interesting, and I would say inspiring and exceptionally admirable, is that despite all of this risks in security and health, women and youth peace builders are the first responders. For example, in Ukraine, in Kherson, which is a state or an oblast near Crimea, the women's network that we are working there has established mobile phone counseling by texting and by calling those that they suspect are vulnerable to increased domestic violence because they are trapped with their abusers for 24 hours a day and for days on end. I mean, because of the lockdown. And we are now supporting them to systematize this even more by hiring professional counselors who can provide support to the to women who are in vulnerable situations. And then in the Philippines, our young women leaders for peace are the first ones to distribute relief packs in settlements of internally displaced people in a place called Marawi, which was devastated because of the airstrikes by the Philippine armed forces. So the young women leaders for peace are not only distributing relief packages, food, and disinfectants, they're also distributing what they refer to as dignity packs, which are sanitary pads, toothpaste, toothbrush, and to women and girls, because often these items are not included in the usual relief packs. So they are the first to go out there and at the same time still promoting peace. And it's not a surprise that they're doing this, because it's there in their DNA to be out there where the crisis is, where the conflict is. They were not threatened by the violence. They are not going to retreat with fear of the virus. Of course, we also ensure that they are, that they're well protected. So we've done some fundraising, and it's still on GoFundMe for those who would like to support, so we can continue enabling these women and youth leaders to continue the response to the crisis, at the same time continue the work on peace. We cannot have peace as one of the casualty of COVID-19.
Thank you so much, and very well said. I saw all of the panelists nodding their head in agreement. Provo, can we turn to you? Thanks.
That's one of the blessings of being with good friends whose work you are so curious about. So thank you for giving us the opportunity to share it. There is a difference in what we are doing, but what I want to preface it is by saying that we knew starting in January, as we were hearing from our colleagues around the world and as we were canceling many of our capacity building programs, what is very clear is that global challenges like the one we face today require collaboration and creative problem solving, dialogue and consensus building, and all of those processes that encourage open and honest communications, build empathy, reduce prejudices, allow us to stay connected in our humanity. And so what we did, I'm going to channel now many of our partners who we connected with immediately. And what we started to do was what we do well, which is create the space for peace builders to come together. So in March, I reached out to NAFCM, which is the National Association for Family and Community Mediation in the US, which is a wonderful partner because many of you who are from New York will probably know them, may belong to NAFCM. And we stepped forward and reached out to about 7 other networks globally, like GPAC, like Peace Direct, like the Alliance for Peacebuilding, and Rotary International, and I'm missing someone, Pax Christi, and said, what can we do to create the space? How can we do this together? And our goal was to create a space for peace builders from around the world to come together, to share information, to share resources, and be supportive of each other, knowing the extraordinary challenges that Mavic has just described people are facing in all of these contexts. In that context, what we also knew is that we were already facing a diminishing public square. The rise of nationalism and the threats to democracy were already in place. And I want to underscore what Gay said, which is the largest migration of populations in human history. All of those require people to come together and require them to come together, whether it's like my wonderful city of Pittsburgh, which has a large concentration of hospitals. There were about 5 hospitals whose CEOs and CFOs knew each other, and they came together to start planning how to share beds. That took collaboration. So whether it's at the local level where you're planning for the number of beds and ventilators you can share, or at the international level where ultimately the vaccine has to be collaborative. I refuse to believe that national boundaries are what is going to prevent how it's administered. So knowing that collaboration and empathy and dialogue was going to be critical every step of the way, we created that space, and clearly there was a need. We started with town halls, as we called them initially, and over 600 people have attended the ones we have held so far. We had 2 in April, 2 in March, 2 in April, and now we've started holding them in Spanish, in Arabic, in Farsi. The next one coming up actually is this Saturday. So what happened in these town halls were they were dialogues that we were facilitating using a forum like this. And we started focusing on 4 thematic areas. Our initial focus was on how do we address reducing panic? Remember now, March seems like a long time ago. But there was a lot of panic about what was going to happen and continues to be in certain areas. How do you minimize the stigmatization that we were already seeing? How do we increase connections and rebuild relationships? And so we organized the dialogues around these themes initially and began to gather information. What we also provided were supports for people to hold the same kinds of dialogues in communities around the world. And so we were seeding that in places, obviously, where there is the possibility of having this kind of technology, and there isn't in many places very clearly. As one of them said, stop talking about washing hands. We don't have running water. We don't have water. So what became very clear also was that all of the analysis and mapping that we use as peace builders were supported through all of our partners in the communities. So they stepped forward to begin to do the kinds of things that are important for peace builders to do, which is to step into the communities to convey the messages of what supports were available, what kind of collaboration was possible, while they were handing out buckets and soap and towels. One of the other key pieces I will mention is that there are countries around the world like Colombia where populations that have always been marginalized were really not believing their governments. So the mistrust in government was one that was replaced by the trust in the peace leaders in the communities. And we saw that as a very critical role to support. Thank you.
Thank you. Very strong point. Alma, over to you now.
Thank you, Gay, and congratulations to everyone for what they have accomplished so far. I'd like to tackle your question a little bit differently, if I may. I'd like to first acknowledge that the individuals and Peacebuilders, and Mavic, thank you for pointing out their courage, but also they've been heavily impacted on a personal level with COVID-19. They had fears around their own safety. They are confronted also with the same health challenges, thinking what happens if I'm in a remote area, will I be able to have access to the medical supplies, etc. And also, and it really affected, I think you said what has changed. It had us think about risk a little bit differently. And I'd like to think that we have shared the world with the threat rather than us going to assist the world. We became part of living the same experience. But it was also a challenge because we're not on the ground, and most of the work that we do has a lot of relevance in the context that we work in, whether in the US or abroad. So for example, in the US, we have been involved in conversations related to vulnerable communities and the use of technology and policing. And COVID-19 became quite of an issue, right? Because a lot of the vulnerable populations, which had already been impacted by racism and discrimination, on top of that, now we have COVID-19 and restricted space. So we've been in conversations about how to mitigate and how to facilitate to colleagues' words about processes and what could be done. So I think we should acknowledge that there may be an element of personal fatigue for Peacebuilders and how to deal with that. The same thing I recall during 9/11 when I did my doctorate on that and came to New York, a lot of the Peacebuilders were saying, we're not the first responders. We are actually, people were looking for basic human needs at the time. And right now with COVID-19, there is a basic level of needs we to think about. Also, much attention now we have to pay attention to is how the wars are being fought. And it's not only just the restricted space, and thank you, the previous speakers addressed that, but also how to deal with it with the lack of movement. And we want to convene, but also technology has had its own faults, right? And how conversations are being followed. So how you run into ethical dilemmas with technology and the safety of people you're working with. And I'd like to say that the extreme cases in some international work we've done, whether Gaza, Palestine, Israel, Yemen, Libya, you've already had severe issues with populations like Gaza under siege, 2 million people. And then you have extreme issues between Israel and Palestine. And then you have the US policy on top of all of this, and multilateral organization being deprived of assistance. And so where are we as Peacebuilders in that conversation? I'm not saying we're not at the table, but it got so complex that I think it has presented us with issues. I'm aware that I'm over time. If later we have a chance, I can maybe add one more thing around data integrity. And I think it's so important during the COVID-19 for us to pay attention to how information is being fed to us. And we run into this in advanced research and assessing situations, but I think the data integrity is one of the biggest issues we have to think about now.
Yes, absolutely. In fact, I just read that misinformation websites vastly outnumber legitimate sources, and how we deal with that and what the ramifications can be for peace and conflict is a major issue. Thank you.
Thank you.
Mel, please.
Violent conflict doesn't necessarily dissipate because of the coronavirus. It's just behind fog with less witnesses, and therefore becomes more dangerous. Some of the methods that unarmed civilian protectors use lend themselves very well to educating and supporting people in this pandemic. So for example, in South Sudan, one of the rumors that has been circulating recently is that only white people can get the coronavirus. And that can be very dangerous on multiple levels. And so what we found is that through our teams in the field and our local partners, that they really are the trusted messengers. And so that they can deal with rumor control just as they do in other situations. And in cases like this, rumors kill people, and they will continue to kill people. Another method is the early warning, early response mechanisms that we help communities set up, where they can identify indicators of violence and then craft responses either to proactively respond to try to stop the violence, or if it's too acute, to react and to flee, but to flee in a way that's safe and where everyone's taken care of. So in this case, the early warning, early response mechanisms can be used to provide early warning about the pandemic and to help communities to come together with the resources that they have to deal with the pandemic. And this is especially challenging in some of the places we work, for example, in Burundi, where there is an official denial of the disease and where it is considered to be a betrayal of the country to talk about the disease. This is all because there's a presidential election a week from tomorrow that people don't want disrupted. At the same time, the Burundian government is telling the monitors from the East African community that they will have to quarantine for 14 days before they're allowed in, which means that they would be allowed in 5 days after the election. So another method that unarmed civilian protectors employ often that lends itself to these situations is to provide protective presence in areas where conflict is either present or has great potential. So in this case, to provide protective presence around food distribution sites that will become more and more contested, and around health facilities, and finally to provide accompaniment to healthcare providers. I want to broaden this out for one more minute, and that is that as we work through this pandemic and this crisis together, it's important to note that we are not at war. We are not at war, and that metaphor does not serve us.
Yeah.
And we collectively can play a role in helping to bend that arc in the direction of collaboration, in the direction of awakening. We have tremendous opportunity right now to change this planet and we will not go back to the way that it was, but we don't have to go back to a more militarized, more authoritarian environment. We can bend it in a more cooperative, imaginative, and creative way.
Thank you, Mel. I'm just letting that sink in. Thank you all. You've all provided such different perspectives and such deep and meaningful ones that now we're going to have the fun part where we have a conversation.
So Michael asked, so far I've heard nothing about the coordination of the work of these great organizations with the work of the United Nations and its agencies. Is there coordination, and has the UN reached out to your organizations?
We are coordinating with the UN, especially UN Women. And well, at this point, it's largely sharing information on what women and youth peace builders are doing. And I must add the Global Coalition on Youth Peace and Security too. We are now working on a database on COVID-19 and women, peace and security, focusing on the initiative of women and youth peace builders, as well as the challenges that they confront, and see, for example, where they are present, we will put them in touch with the chapters of the organizations that we work with. And I'm making a note as my fellow panelists are speaking, and especially Mel, because there's a number of countries where we both are operating and implementing initiatives that support women's participation in peace processes, as well as responses to the crisis. So we are coordinating with some agencies and entities in the UN. A short answer to the question of Michael.
And Michael, we do work with various UN agencies, most prominently in South Sudan, where there is a UN peacekeeping mission of about 15,000 troops. We have worked with them over the years, and now as they tend to stay more in shelter, we are providing them with information as to where the needs are emerging around the country. We are also providing training to various entities of the UN on how to use unarmed approaches as opposed to using guns to try to bring peace.
We should be all thinking of how to save multilateral organizations from continuous attacks. They're not perfect organizations, but they are one of the major conveners of the world community. And I think it's so important that whether as sole practitioners or non-governmental organizations, that we think through how to enable them to do their work better and how to partner with them to do their work better, but also how to protect them from narrative that is destructive. They may not be perfect, but I think we need to enable the international community to have a safe space to come and talk to each other in a constructive way. So this is the way I would like to respond to such question, not them coming to us, but also seeing it as a partnership with them. Whether again, I'm a for-profit, small operation, but I'd like to think that I have a role to play in that conversation.
We have a question in the chat box that I'm going to ask if that's okay. This is from Melissa Manis. It says, thank you so much. With regards to domestic violence, what are the current conversations around preparedness for when lockdown is over? Likewise, what about any ongoing monitoring online for people signaling for help? Is this going on?
Also, we have 3 questions in the Q&A, so maybe we'll take a few of them and then start a dialogue. One is for Mel. What do you think the biggest obstacle of making this time more of a collaborative effort? Are other countries working toward coordination rather than competition? That's one. And a second is, what is the level of support being provided by regional organizations like the African Union or the Arab League to their states, and what is missing?
I think, first of all, we have to recognize that we are collaborating, and we are collaborating in amazing and courageous ways every day, where people are stepping up and protecting and saving other people that they don't know. That's happening in New York at this very moment. And I think it's important to point out that 70% of the frontline health care workers in the world are women, and that this collaboration is happening. That is what we have to build on, not the type of attack that Alma brought up on multilateralism, whether that be the World Health Organization or the Security Council. As much as we do have our disagreements, those are always disagreements within the family, so to speak. And so the first thing is to hold up those opportunities that are already happening, and then to look at how do we build towards a time when, recognizing that this pandemic is just part of the destruction of our planet. And how do we go forward dealing with the climate disruption that's happening that poses a greater threat, and to build the connections. And I think that it has to come from civil society first, that civil society will lead the way and then others will follow.
Thanks. I'd like to hand over to Prabha because I think she's going to have to leave before the end. If that's still true, Prabha, why don't you take the floor? And then Mavic.
Sure. I want to reinforce something Mel said, which is the metaphors being used. I think we have to rise to the occasion to create narratives that are built on resilience and collaboration. I cannot underscore this. To continue to use the terminology that governments are using is inadequate and harmful, quite frankly. So beginning to change that narrative is one of our responsibilities. And to that effect, there have been themes that have come up, and domestic violence and mental health have been global. That is not confined to any one part of the world. And everything I'm speaking about comes from the participants in the town halls, from the people who have reached out, from the little things they've done, like creating posters, to education. But domestic violence continues to be a theme in many places, as you all know. It's true as much in New York as it is in any other part of the world. Sadly, there is not much difference. But there are organizations beginning to do things, and it's all local, which is why I'm really glad the New York Peace Institute organized this, because what we are finding is all of it is local. We have to figure out how to do it at the local level. And that's what we do at Mediators Beyond Borders. So there are innovative things people are doing by creating hand signals for victims of violence who might have the occasion to come out in public so that others recognize it, and doing the kinds of campaigns that domestic violence advocates have always done. For as long as I have been in the field working with victims of violence, the creativity has come from there. The other piece is, it's very interesting. We started using the term physical distancing to say, we will remain connected. We are not required to separate socially. So we have been promoting physical distancing and not social distancing, because there's nothing asocial or antisocial. Look at us. I don't know how many people are here, but we are gathered and we are connecting and we are sharing resources. So I think it's really important to take hold of the narrative and begin to use the examples that we are seeing. And interestingly, it's women. You know, we support women around the world. We've been consulting with women's networks for the last 6 years. We've been supporting global cohorts of women as peace leaders. And in a lot of these places, it is the women who are stepping forward in their communities because they're trusted leaders in lots of other ways. The other thing we have been doing is reaching out to each other. I think this pandemic is an opportunity for unlikely partners to come together. It's not about who is an international organization and who's a local organization anymore. These spaces create the opportunity for all of us to feel connected. And if this doesn't help us move the agenda forward in terms of having to work together, I don't know what will. I think I want to underscore the climate change discussions, pushing forward that it will again take collaboration in order for us not to go back to something that existed, but to create a new normal. The responsibility is on us. I don't know any other group that has stepped forward. These conversations are happening amongst peacebuilders and journalists more than they are among engineers or astronauts or any other professional group. So I feel like there is a great deal of responsibility we carry as peacebuilders to address this issue collaboratively. Thank you.
Thank you, Provo. Go ahead now.
Thank you, Gay. I would like to respond to 2 questions. The first one is on domestic violence, and Melissa is asking what are the current conversations around preparedness after the lockdown. First of all, the COVID-19 pandemic has spotlighted discrimination, marginalization, and violence against women and girls in an unprecedented manner. And across the world, what we've been observing, because we're consulting with our partners, we're looking at statistics, calling national police institutions, there is a decrease generally on different types of crimes, crime against property, felony, etc. But there's a spike on domestic violence. And my hats off to the shelters, the violence against women shelters that have continued to open and have continued to accept more women and children who are seeking for help. And for example, we have one of our members in Nepal, and they've continued to and they kept their shelters open, including to new arrivals. after the lockdown, we collectively, but most importantly, we need to hold government to account to ensure that that there will be more systematic and increased availability of psychosocial counseling services and even legal assistance if the women victims or survivors decide to file legal cases, and that not only that shelters would should remain open, and in fact more shelters should be opened, but also other forms of support, including economic support, because many of these women are trapped in this situation even before the pandemic because they are dependent, financially or economically dependent on on the men or others that they have intimate relationship with. The second question that I would like to respond to is from Nicholas Smith, where he was asking, what is one practical suggestion you can give to conflict resolution professionals to reduce the impact of conflict on coronavirus response? This is the best opportunity to discuss a more comprehensive response to violent conflicts. The shift from national security to human security, because the health crisis, it's not just a health crisis per se, it's a political crisis. The weakness of national government institutions to respond and provide health care. After all, human security consists of elements like health security, economic security, community security, and these are all absent in the current framework that most government use to respond to conflict, which is national security.
Thanks. Alma, did you have a word here?
I had 2 points I want to make. That COVID-19 has also exacerbated violence in conflict zones, where we've done some research on that. Where also, it's not just women who have become recipients of domestic violence. Some men came out of the war, as we have seen in the US, with PTSD, and there is more evidence in other parts of the world that men are also suffering from violence against them in the communities and domestically. Another point I wanted to raise very quickly, we don't have time for it, but to pay attention to human trafficking in the time of COVID-19, which is, again, all the kinds of illicit trade that take place have been exacerbated. Not only the borders are closed, but these what should we call them? These entities manage to practice whatever they're practicing in illicit trade that is in human trafficking, that could continue to be more harm and create a lot of violence in the homes.
First, let me say thank you, Prabha. I know you have to go to another meeting. Thanks for being with us. We're going to stay on a little bit longer for those people who are interested. And yes, the questions there's lots of similarities. What are some of the most important skills that Peacebuilders should have? What's a practical suggestion you can give on how to reduce the impact of the virus? What skills do you think are most important caring at this time? So please go ahead.
I'd like to comment about one of the most important things we continue. I like what Mel says because he takes an appreciative approach, but I'd like to say, in addition to all the collaboration that we're seeing, we need collaboration on all levels. The NGOs, the individual practitioners, the multilateral organizations. So one of the skills really is to continue to map out who's doing what, and to avoid repetition, and to become an enabler of other people's work. And in the environment of COVID-19, I'm not a trauma specialist, but I think it would be of great value. I have some training, but not enough, is to really read more about that. Because when you have collective trauma, the behaviors are not necessarily the same as when your life is good and you're walking and you're moving and socializing. So I think these are two additional skills. And then being tuned into vulnerable populations in your communities that you have been separated from. We know the Black community and Hispanic community in particular were severely impacted. So one of the most important skills of a peace builder is to look where other people did not look.
Thank you.
I think one of the most important things that peace builders can do is to continue to break down isolation and to do that in very practical ways so that people stay connected. This is a time where disconnection, isolation can be encouraged and can be lethal in and of itself. So to be at practical, easy ways of people checking in with each other, people having buddies, people talking to each other to make sure that they're okay, those kind of simple, basic neighborhood community building things. Secondly, to have systems in the communities where you work, where trusted messengers can speak quickly to people about rumors that come up. And so that people are aware of what is true that's happening and what is being used to manipulate them.
Thanks. There's one question: how can one equip oneself better to deal with situations like this? And I have to say, the first thing that occurred to me, even though we can't do it right now, is if you can, take a course in mediation, like the one I took at the New York Peace Institute many years ago, which made me want to become a board member. It gave me life skills in terms of communication, in terms of reframing, in terms of active listening and showing if I can understand people. And I think these are skills needed anytime in our professional lives, in our personal lives. And obviously it's a bit hard at the moment, but I would make a pitch that everyone should look for that as much as they can in their communities.
Agreed.
I'm talking to the converted, probably. There is one question from someone who works with IDPs in Northeast Nigeria. How do you work around rising tension and conflict with the basic needs of displaced persons and social distancing and quarantine?
Yeah, so we actually work in northeastern Nigeria, in Gombe and Bauchi. I hope I'm pronouncing the names of the states right. And what we find effective is working with cultural leaders, paramount chiefs, and leaders of faith-based organizations or church leaders. Because in places, in remote communities, which are, far from capital, far from the seat of government, they have much more influence to their people. But unfortunately, in many cases, they also provide sanction to cultural beliefs and practices that are violating women and girls' rights. For example, female genital mutilation, or the concept of leadership, that leadership equals male leadership. But if we are able to convince those cultural leaders, I would like to shift now to another example. In Sierra Leone, we've worked with the National Association of Paramount Chiefs to talk about, talk about the problems brought about by female genital mutilation and child and early marriage. And when they were convinced, they were the ones who are, discouraging those practices in their community. So this is the same in any situation, even with COVID-19. If you are able to forge partnership with those influential community elders or cultural leaders, then you're on your way to to an effective response to the conflict and the pandemic.
Thanks. Mel?
I think that it's important in every location, including in areas in Northeast Nigeria, to start out with capacity recognition, with really looking at what the community has. And Mavic gave some traditional examples. What other formal and informal structures are there that could be effective right now? Mm-hmm. And I was struck when Prabha said earlier that someone said, wash our hands, we don't have water. because you cannot do everything in one location, you can do some things. And so to work with communities, first of all, to see how they're dealing with the situation themselves and what can be enhanced and supported, and then picking out those kinds of things that can be done, that can play a role in preventing the further spread of the pandemic and the subsequent further spread of violence.
Thank you. Before I move to Alma, I just want to mention, someone asked about local mutual aid movements. And while I don't know a lot, I take from that something that I think is very important that we've said in many ways. Local communities are not objects to be helped or given something by internationals or even their own government. They are subjects in their, we have to recognize the capacities that they have to self-protect and to organize and to provide mutual aid. And I think that's something that, especially sitting here in my perch in New York and working a lot at the UN, I see that we forget to recognize very often. And it's something very important, that local agency and the primacy of local actors is something that we should respect and uphold. Alma, sorry to cut you off.
No, actually, I have a great example on what you said. I was going to respond recently in Iraq on the work on security and development. You know, Tel Afar, which was destroyed by ISIS completely, and it had Turkomans, Shiites, Sunnis, and every, you know, the Nineveh region is quite diverse. And they started thinking of how to ensure the safety of people coming back to those communities. And so what they did, they enabled actually the educated and the people who have some sort of knowledge and education on a very, very local level to become not wearing police clothes, but actually help the community come and dialogue at a community center. And the international community's aid was mostly financial, rather than leading the conversation because of the economic situation there. So I think we should also, when people ask what Peacebuilders should do, we should reflect that America could also learn from these protracted conflicts internationally, where over time they really had to deal with very, very little. And with the very little, to Mel's point, people became creative and thinking more of how to enable the local community in spite of all the adversity. And so resilience definitely would be one of the skills that we should understand and build on. Thank you, Gay, for the time on that.
Thanks.
Yeah.
Any other thoughts or comments?
There is one on trauma, and I would like to, I'm sure the New York Peace Institute has the capability, but I think we should think through how is it showing with us as peace builders. Again, I'd like to iterate that self-care is one of the important skills that we should engage in, and not just looking outside, but helping ourselves first so we are enablers of others.
One from Michael, Cassandra. The dangers of COVID-19 in US prisons. Can anyone talk about any work they are doing to alleviate the condition of inmates in the countries that they work in?
I would just say that my students explored that question quite a bit at George Mason on vulnerable communities. And the news is still not very good, but we know that many states are releasing prisoners internationally. It's the same way, but we should also think of political prisoners who maybe are not known to be where they are and where they are locked in during COVID-19. So we didn't cover that, but hopefully in the future we could talk about that too.
Yeah, I also saw a call from the organization CARE about 7,000 children in a camp in Iraq or Syria, I don't remember. These are children who have foreign nationalities. They are not Syrian, they are the children of fighters.
Yes.
Held in very dire conditions, and saying that the governments of whom these children are nationals should take them back to their country and protect them because they're utterly at the mercy of the virus where they are. So we can look at prisoners in many different guises. I think my aim has been fulfilled. It's been a wide-ranging discussion on a lot of subjects. I hope the people who are listening enjoyed it as much as some of our people who are deep into conflict resolution, I think we see that we really, all hands are needed on this. This is everyone's business in every field. And those who have a comparative advantage, be it a state or an international organization or a local organization, really need to work together. And I think the word communication and collaboration has been underscored many times. I've also been struck by the need to work on the positive and use an appreciative inquiry approach, as Alma mentioned, and not the negative. It's not that we have to stop violence or stop terrorism, but rather we need to work for health, work for peace, work for community and resilience. And I think all of the many good things that our organizations and others are doing will rise to the fore. And if we really are on a precipice with two divergent paths, let's just hope that this really leads to more consciousness in the world from all of us, and that we advocate that with all of our elected officials and make sure that we connect rather than separate.
I just want to say that the US is watched very closely, and we need to rethink how we're positioning ourselves internationally. We were a role model on many occasions, and we should reclaim that when we're on the right track of doing so.
Mavik, please.
Yeah, just very quickly, while we face many challenges, and I and my fellow panelists have emphasized all of that, including the fact that COVID-19 is a conflict multiplier because of the increased competition for resources, including medical supplies and medical services. But there are also, let's also look at the opportunities or possible silver lining of this crisis. And for us feminist peace builders, we're not only thinking of the current situation, we are learning from this devastating experience, and we are seizing the opportunity to demand even more strongly from governments, from the United Nations, from regional organizations, donors, private sector, and fellow civil society actors to change our ways of working, including especially how we respond to conflict and crisis. And it's interesting to hear when people say, oh, when everything normalizes, when we go back to normal. I would like to immediately say, we're not going back to normal. We do not want to go back to normal. We need to do things differently. We will insist on ways of working that are founded on feminist values and human rights principles.
Thank you. Alma, Mel, any last thoughts?
Well, I'm struck a number of the themes that came through, in addition to collaboration, of resilience and making sure that we're taking care of ourselves and each other in this process. And so often, and I experienced it this morning at an early morning telephone call where I maybe had 2 hours of sleep. And when we were going around, everybody saying, how are you doing? Fine. Okay. Yeah, we're doing okay. We're not doing okay. And I think it's okay to give space for people to say, I'm really scared, or I'm really depressed, or I really don't have much hope today. And to just open and help each other to express that, because the more we stuff it, the more it's going to control us.
Thanks. Alma.
Well, I'm thinking, again, I go back, I just taught a course, and some of my students are international students who are not going to be able to go home soon. They're going to be having a lot of financial responsibilities. So sometimes, you know, even the people who had privilege, now everything has changed. And so we may be concentrating on people who historically have been vulnerable. But in this COVID-19, like I said, we have to be looking in different places and seeing whose conditions have changed dramatically. We've seen American companies go down, unemployment, New York, the state that we love, a lot of change, the streets are empty. So the new normal, to Mivik's point, is not gonna be the same. And there are opportunities for us to rethink even what we value. But I would also say the moral compass and the ethical dilemmas we're going to be confronted with. If I have to get closer to someone and I'm a peace builder and the biology might infect my biology, there's going to be a lot of ethical considerations we have to think about.
Thank you. That reminds me that I just read a John Paul Lederach quotation about this time, and those of us who are in this field know he's almost the father of the field. He said, "We must respond to this pandemic by strengthening relationships, using curiosity and creativity, and taking risks to make things better." So to your point, Alma, there will be risks, there will be ethical considerations, but we cannot be stopped by them.
A huge thank you to our panelists here today. I know it's been a treat for me, and I think it's been a treat for all of the attendees here as well to hear your perspective on, the international scene and how COVID is impacting communities abroad, because, at the New York Peace Institute especially, we're so focused on what's happening here in New York City. And we're not used to experiencing pandemics of this kind. This is a new reality for us. And I think it's so instrumental and instructional for us to hear from you all who've been working in places that have had more similar experiences in the past. And I also just want to echo, what I'm hearing today is these themes of empathy and collaboration and dialogue. And as we all do our work, it's sometimes hard to remember how important collaboration is. And I feel like all of the themes we're hearing today are things we should be applying in New York City and thinking really more about how to work across every kind of line that exists. And I know there were questions and thoughts about marginalized communities in particular and how they're being impacted by COVID, and just how they're impacted generally. And I know we all want to work together to try to mitigate some of those discrepancies. And so I really appreciate the conversation today. I also really just wanted to highlight again, what was said, that we're not social distancing, we're physical distancing. And I think that also is a really important point, and one that we forget. I'm going to start saying that now moving forward also, because I think we're not. This is a unique opportunity. We're all here together, and it's such a treat.
2 points. One, we've taken to calling it spacious solidarity.
I like that.
And secondly, I do note that this is a fundraiser, and I, as someone who's been a donor to the New York Peace Institute, want to urge people who are listening this is another way to participate, to donate to the New York Peace Institute, because it's worth it. It's there, it's on the ground, it's doing the work that has to be done right now.
I do want to say, this is a difficult time for all nonprofits everywhere. I, really appreciate all of your support today. I appreciate you saying that, Mel, and I know, you all, just by joining this conversation today, are supporting New York Peace Institute and supporting nonprofits everywhere. But also, this is a PeaceRaiser, and it's a fundraising campaign as well. And in order to continue to do the important work that we're all doing, we do need financial support as well. So in addition, we asked you just to spread the word about New York Peace Institute. It's not only about giving financially and making donations, although obviously that's appreciated, but also, letting other people know about our services, letting people know that we're here in New York City, and that we're here to support everybody, whether it's through our training or our mediation programs, and we want people to know that. So also just spreading the word about New York Peace Institute, and I look forward to collaborating with all of you moving forward. I hope we can collaborate more. And, again, I just really appreciate you all being here. Thank you again to all of you, and especially to Gay, who is our beloved board member and helped pull this all together, and to all of the NYPI staff who are here and supported us, and to our incredible panel of volunteer mediators. We're so grateful, and we look forward to seeing you all soon. Stay safe and healthy, everybody.
Thank you.
Thanks all.
Thank you very much.